David Martinez smiled at me across the courtroom like he'd already won, reaching for the pen to sign the custody papers. "Finally gonna get what I deserve," he said loud enough for everyone to hear. His friend sitting next to him laughed like they were at a party instead of court. That's when I stood up from my seat in the back, my sneakers making soft sounds on the shiny floor. Each step felt like counting down to something big. If you're watching right now, please hit subscribe and tell me what state you're from in the comments. My name is Margaret Chen, I'm 64 years old, and I've been waiting 3 whole years for this day. While David thought he was about to take my grandson away from his mother, I was about to show everyone the truth. The folder I carried had papers inside that would change everything. And honestly, I was happy watching him think he'd already won. "Judge, sir," I said clearly, even though my heart was beating super fast. "Before anything gets decided, you should look at where David was on the day he says he signed these forms." I walked forward and gave the papers to the court helper. David's smile disappeared a tiny bit. His friend stopped laughing. The judge opened my folder and read everything really carefully. Felt like forever. I could see David moving around in his chair, starting to feel worried. His friend tried to whisper something, but David told him to be quiet, still trying to act confident. "Mr. Martinez," the judge finally said, his voice serious and strong. "This paper shows you signed a rental agreement at a storage place on Tuesday morning. But these phone records and security camera pictures show you were actually at a casino 3 hours away during that same time." David's face turned white like he'd seen a ghost. His friend was looking through papers quickly, clearly surprised by this news. My daughter Jessica looked confused but hopeful for the first time in months. "Also," the judge kept going, "lying in official court papers is called perjury, which is a crime. And trying to trick the court to get custody you don't deserve is very serious." He looked up from the papers with a face that showed he'd seen liars before and had no patience for them anymore. "Officer, please take this man into custody." Watching the police put handcuffs on David's wrists felt better than winning the lottery. After 3 years of watching him lie about my daughter and try to take away her son just to hurt her, seeing his plan fall apart into criminal charges was absolutely wonderful. Jessica ran over and hugged me tight as David was walked away, still saying he didn't do anything wrong to anyone who'd listen. But here's what David didn't know about me. I hadn't just accidentally found his lies. I'd been collecting proof against him for 3 years, piece by careful piece. This court day wasn't the end by accident. It was exactly where I'd planned for everything to end. Let me tell you how this whole mess started. Because David Martinez didn't just randomly come into our family. He picked us on purpose, like picking a target, and I was the only one who saw it from the very beginning. 3 years ago, I was working part-time at a grocery store when a friendly young man with expensive shoes came through my checkout line, making jokes and asking questions about my day. Warning signs should have been waving everywhere. But my coworker Susan thought he was charming and nice. David was 35 back then, good-looking in that too-perfect way that made me not trust him. And he had this special way of making people feel important and special. He said he worked fixing computers and helping small businesses. The funny part about that would become clear later. I watched him talk to customers and workers, noticing how he asked very specific questions about people's families and home lives. What worried me most was how interested he seemed in people who lived alone or had kids without much help. "You know, Margaret," he said after buying groceries one day, "I'd love to help you set up a better phone plan sometime. Maybe we could talk about it over coffee." I was 61, my husband had died 2 years before after 30 years together, and I'll admit the attention felt nice. But something about his eyes reminded me of a salesman trying to sell something nobody needs. I said no thank you, being polite about it. But David didn't give up easily. He started showing up at the library where I went every Thursday, always with some story about being there by accident. He'd mention casually that he wanted to find a nice family to be part of, maybe someone with kids who needed help. That's when I realized he'd been researching me. David knew I had a daughter named Jessica who was divorced and struggling alone with her little boy. He knew about my husband's life insurance money and the small house I owned. Worst of all, he knew I was the type of mom who would do anything to see her child happy. Jessica was 32 then, working 2 jobs as a teacher's helper to take care of my grandson Tommy after her first husband left them for someone younger. 6-year-old Tommy barely saw his dad anymore. And Jessica was exhausted trying to do everything by herself. When David started volunteering at the community pool where Jessica took Tommy for swimming lessons, I knew exactly what he was doing. Within 4 months, he was Jessica's hero, helping drive Tommy to school and helping with reading practice, while somehow learning everything about our family's money situation. Jessica thought she'd found her perfect partner. I knew she'd found someone dangerous. But David made one big mistake in all his careful planning. He didn't realize that a mom who'd spent decades watching her money carefully and noticing when something seemed wrong would recognize a liar when she saw one. The first time David came to my house for Sunday lunch, I made my special chicken soup and watched him be extra nice to everyone. He said kind things about everything from my cooking to my flowers outside, asked questions about family stories, and played cards with Tommy like he was trying to win an award for best dad ever. Jessica looked happier than I'd seen her since before her marriage ended. David held her hand when we said grace before eating, helped clean up without being asked, and even talked nicely about the family pictures on my shelf. To anyone watching, he seemed like the perfect gentleman visitor. Except I was watching very carefully, and perfect gentlemen make me nervous. While Jessica was in the kitchen helping me get dessert ready, David said he needed to use the bathroom. Normal enough, except the bathroom was down the hall to the left, and I watched him go into my office on the right. When I quietly followed a minute later, I found him taking pictures of my bank papers and bills with his phone. "David," I said from the doorway, keeping my voice sweet and friendly. "Did you get lost?" He jumped like I'd caught him stealing cookies. "Oh, Margaret, yeah, I was just... This is a nice room, very neat and organized." He pointed at my filing cabinets like he'd been looking at how tidy everything was instead of stealing my private information. "Thank you. I think keeping good records is important for keeping your things safe." I said the word safe, just enough to let him know I wasn't as easy to fool as he thought. "The bathroom is just down the hall, dear." That night, after David took Jessica and Tommy home, I sat in that same office and made a decision that would save my family 3 years later. If David Martinez thought he could trick his way into our lives and our money, he was about to learn that this grandma had been protecting her family since before he learned to lie so well. The next morning I called my lawyer, Mr. Wilson, who'd been helping with my family's legal stuff since my husband died. "Mr. Wilson, I need to make my money and house extra protected against anyone trying to steal from me or trick me." "What's happening, Margaret? This seems sudden." "Let's just say I'm worried about someone bad coming around my family, and I want to make sure my daughter and grandson are safe." Mr. Wilson worked for 2 weeks creating a complicated system where my money was protected in special accounts that would be very hard for anyone to access without lots of checking. Every big decision about my money needed approval from both Mr. Wilson and my bank manager, who'd known me for 12 years. Most importantly, Mr. Wilson included special rules requiring me to come to the office in person with multiple ID cards for any changes to who could access my accounts. Any attempt to fake my signature or change documents would automatically freeze everything until proper legal review could happen. "This is very thorough, Margaret," Mr. Wilson said when we finished. "Are you sure you want this much protection? It makes everything more complicated, even for you." "Mr. Wilson, some things are worth the trouble. If I'm right about this man, my family is going to need every protection we can put in place." 2 months later, Jessica announced she was getting married to David Martinez. He'd asked her during a romantic weekend trip, giving her a ring that probably cost more than she made in 2 months. When I asked how he could afford such an expensive ring with what he said he made fixing computers, Jessica got defensive and said I was being mean about her happiness. The wedding was beautiful, I'll admit that. David spent lots of money on flowers, food, and a photographer who took pictures of everything Jessica thought was the start of her fairy tale. I smiled during the ceremony, danced at the party, and welcomed my new son-in-law into the family with proper enthusiasm. But that night, I went home and started a detailed notebook writing down David's behavior and suspicious things about his money. I had a feeling I was going to need every piece of proof I could gather. For the first year of Jessica and David's marriage, I almost thought maybe I'd been wrong about him. He seemed truly devoted to Jessica, treated Tommy like his own son, and even remembered my birthday with thoughtful gifts. He kept a steady job with a real computer company, helped pay bills, and seemed to be settling into being a responsible family man. Almost thought I'd been wrong, but a snake doesn't change its skin. It just learns to hide it better. The first crack in David's perfect husband act appeared during Thanksgiving dinner in year 2. Jessica had invited me over for what she called a family money planning talk, though the sound in her voice told me it was more like an intervention. David sat at the head of their dining table like he was in charge, a big folder of papers spread in front of him as he explained their concerns about how I managed my money. "Margaret, we've been thinking, and we believe you might need some professional help with your savings and house," he started, his voice dripping with fake concern. "Jessica mentioned you've been handling everything yourself since Robert died, and at your age, that's a lot of responsibility for someone managing substantial assets alone." I drank my cider and waited for the real pitch because this was definitely leading somewhere specific. "David has some wonderful connections with financial people," Jessica added enthusiastically. "He could help you reorganize things, maybe get better returns, and create a more secure plan for passing things down to family." "How thoughtful," I replied. "And what would this reorganizing involve exactly?" David leaned forward like a salesman who smells a sale coming. "Well, for starters, we'd want to put all your different accounts together for better management. Transfer everything to one company where I have professional relationships that could help you significantly. We could also update your legal documents. Some of those protections Mr. Wilson created are unnecessarily complicated for today's world." There it was. After 2 years of playing the devoted son-in-law, David was finally making his move on the family money. He wanted to put my carefully protected accounts into a company where he had connections, and he wanted to simplify the protections that Mr. Wilson had specifically designed to stop fraud. "That's quite generous of you to offer," I said, maintaining my grandma voice while my brain calculated his angles. "But I'm quite happy with my current arrangements. Mr. Wilson has been handling my affairs since Robert's death, and I trust his judgment completely." David's smile got tighter, almost invisible. "Of course, and I'm sure Mr. Wilson is wonderful for basic needs. But Margaret, you're talking about money that could be performing much better with proper professional management. Don't you want to maximize what you're leaving for Jessica and Tommy?" The guilt trip. Classic manipulation move. Make the victim feel selfish for protecting their own money by suggesting they're somehow harming their loved ones by not turning control over to the manipulator. I'd seen this exact approach in the senior fraud prevention classes I'd started attending. "I appreciate your concern for my family's financial future," I said, setting down my glass carefully. "But I'm curious, David. How do you know so much about my money levels?" I don't recall sharing specific details with anyone. Jessica shifted uncomfortably. "Mom, we weren't trying to snoop. It's just that David has experience with planning, and when I mentioned some of the financial discussions we've had." "What financial discussions?" I interrupted, my grandma mask slipping slightly. "I don't recall having detailed conversations about my savings with you, Sarah." The silence that followed was heavy with meaning. David's face had gone carefully blank, but I could see the thinking behind his eyes. Jessica looked confused and slightly embarrassed, like a child who'd accidentally revealed she'd been listening to adult conversations. "I may have noticed some paperwork when I was helping you organize last spring," Jessica said weakly. "Paperwork about what specifically?" I kept my voice gentle, but I was furious because I don't recall needing help with any financial organizing recently. David cleared his throat, apparently deciding to take control. "Margaret, I think there might be some misunderstanding here. Jessica and I are just trying to look out for your best interests as you get older." We're family after all. Family. The word that liars always use when they want something they haven't earned. That night, I went home and called Mr. Wilson first thing Monday morning to add additional security measures to all my accounts. 3 days after that uncomfortable Thanksgiving dinner, I did something I'd never imagined doing in my 63 years. I hired a private detective. Not because I enjoyed being suspicious of my son-in-law, but because protecting my family required knowing exactly what kind of person had married into it. Linda Foster came highly recommended by Mr. Wilson's law firm as someone who specialized in background checks and financial fraud cases. She was a serious woman in her 50s who'd spent 20 years as a police detective before going private, and she had the kind of sharp eyes that missed nothing important. "What exactly are you looking for, Mrs. Chen?" Linda asked during our first meeting in her office. "The truth about David Martinez," I replied. "I have strong suspicions about his character and intentions, but I need facts before I can protect my family properly." Linda's first report arrived just 12 days later, and it was worse than even my suspicious mind had imagined. David Martinez wasn't just a regular con artist. He was a calculated fraud artist with a documented pattern of targeting women with children and their families' money. His work history was a masterpiece of lies and hiding things. The computer consulting work consisted of short-term jobs at various companies, usually ending when bosses discovered problems with client information handling or inappropriate access to private information. He'd been fired from 4 different companies for breaking rules related to client privacy. More disturbing was his relationship history. Linda had found evidence of 3 previous serious relationships with single mothers who had family money or valuable property. All 3 relationships had ended badly, with the women reporting suspicious financial activity and missing personal documents after David moved out. The first woman, Rebecca Davis from Oregon, had dated David for 7 months. During their relationship, she'd experienced identity theft that emptied her bank account and maxed out her credit cards. The theft happened just 3 weeks after she'd given David a spare key to her apartment for emergencies. The second woman, Maria Santos from Texas, had been engaged to David for 5 months before discovering he'd been using her personal information to apply for credit cards and loans in her name. By the time she discovered the fraud, David had disappeared, leaving her with over $35,000 in debt she didn't create. The third woman, Amanda Price from Arizona, lost her entire inheritance from her grandmother after David convinced her to invest it in a fake business opportunity. "Mrs. Chen," Linda said when she called to discuss the report, "this man follows a consistent pattern. He targets women with children and money, builds trust over time, then gradually gains access to financial information before executing fraud. The fact that he's been married to your daughter for 2 years suggests your family is his biggest target yet." I felt cold satisfaction knowing that my 3 years of careful preparation had not only protected my family but was now giving me the evidence I needed. "What happens now?" "Now we document everything and wait for him to make his move," Linda replied. "Because men like David always make their move eventually." As I sat in my kitchen that night staring at Linda's report, I felt sick about what this meant for Jessica and Tommy. David hadn't just fallen in love with my daughter. He'd been studying our family for years, learning our weaknesses, and planning his approach to our money. The next morning I made a decision that would change everything. Instead of confronting David directly or trying to convince Jessica of his true nature, I was going to let him make his move while making sure he'd walk straight into a legal trap that would destroy him. I called Mr. Wilson and asked him to prepare additional fraud prevention measures that would be triggered the moment David attempted any unauthorized access to my accounts. Every document would be protected with multiple verification requirements, and any attempt at forgery would automatically generate evidence for criminal prosecution. "Margaret, you're essentially building a financial fortress," Mr. Wilson said after reviewing my instructions. "Are you absolutely certain this level of preparation is necessary?" "Mr. Wilson, I'm about to let a predator think he's found easy prey. I want to make sure that when he strikes, he destroys himself in the process." 8 months later, Linda called with news that made my blood run cold. David had been making inquiries about my financial accounts, using Jessica's name and our relationship to try to get information from my bank and investment firm. He was finally ready to make his move, and I was more than ready to spring my trap. The morning that changed everything started with Jessica calling me at 7 in the morning, her voice shaking with anger and hurt. I was in my kitchen making tea when the phone rang, and I knew immediately from her tone that my 3-year wait was finally over. "Mom, I need you to come over right now, and bring Mr. Wilson if you can reach him. Something terrible has happened." When I arrived at Jessica's house an hour later with Mr. Wilson, we found Jessica sitting at her kitchen table surrounded by documents and looking like she'd been hit by a truck. But there was something in her face I hadn't seen in years, the fierce determination she'd inherited from me. "He's been lying to me about everything," Jessica said immediately. "David's been using fake job records, false references, and stolen identities. I found bank statements showing deposits that don't match his claimed salary, and credit card bills for expenses I never approved." Mr. Wilson examined the documents with the focused attention of someone who'd spent decades studying financial fraud. "Jessica, how did you discover all this?" "I got suspicious when he started pressuring me about Mom's money," she replied, pointing at a stack of papers. "So I hired someone to do a background check on my own husband. Turns out David Martinez barely exists legally. His social security number belongs to someone who died 6 years ago." I felt cold satisfaction settling in my chest. After 3 years of watching and waiting, David had finally overplayed his hand badly enough for Jessica to see through his act. "There's more," Jessica continued, her voice hardening. "I found fake power of attorney documents in his desk drawer. He's been planning to take control of your accounts, Mom. The signatures look like yours, but they're dated from last week when you were visiting Aunt Susan in Florida." Mr. Wilson studied the forged documents with growing concern. "These are sophisticated forgeries, but they have several legal flaws that would make them worthless in court. More importantly, attempting to use forged documents to access someone else's money is multiple felonies." I pulled out my phone and called Linda, asking her to bring copies of her detective report to Jessica's house immediately. When she arrived 40 minutes later, we spread her findings across the dining room table like evidence in a trial. "David has been running the same con for years," Linda explained to Jessica. "You're actually the longest relationship he's maintained, which suggests he saw your family as his biggest potential score." Jessica stared at the evidence of David's other victims with growing horror. "Those poor women. And I defended him to you, Mom. I actually got angry at you for being suspicious of him. You wanted to believe in love and second chances," I said gently. "There's nothing wrong with that. The problem was that David was never offering either of those things honestly." Mr. Wilson was studying the forged documents with renewed interest. "Margaret, these forgeries give us everything we need to file criminal charges. Identity theft, attempted fraud, forgery. We're looking at multiple felonies with clear intent." "Good," Jessica said, her voice hard as steel. "I want him prosecuted for everything he's done to me, to those other women, to our entire family." That afternoon we walked into the police station together. A grandmother who'd spent 3 years building a trap, a daughter who'd finally seen through a master manipulator's lies, and a lawyer with enough evidence to put a career criminal behind bars where he belonged. Detective Harris took our statement and said it was one of the most well-documented fraud cases he'd ever seen. "Mrs. Chen, your financial protections prevented any actual loss, but the attempted fraud is more than enough for serious criminal charges." David walked into his house that evening expecting his usual welcoming scene. Jessica making dinner, Tommy doing homework, and domestic comfort masking his carefully planned con. Instead, he found 4 adults sitting in his living room like judges, surrounded by evidence of his fraudulent life spread across the coffee table. The look on his face was priceless. Pure panic followed by rapid mental calculation of which lie to tell first. "Jessica, honey, what's going on here?" he said, setting down his briefcase carefully. "Why does everyone look so serious?" "David Martinez," I said, my voice sweet but sharp. Or should I say David Patterson? It's getting hard to keep track of which identity you're using to commit fraud this week. Jessica stood up, and I'd never been prouder of my daughter's strength. Don't even think about lying to me anymore, David. I know about the forged documents. I know about Rebecca Davis, Maria Santos, and Amanda Price. And I know about what you tried to do to my mother. David's friendly act cracked completely. The warm smile disappeared, revealing something cold and mean underneath. You have no idea what you're dealing with here, Jessica. Your mother is a paranoid old woman who's been sabotaging our marriage from day one because she can't stand seeing you happy. Excuse me, I said, standing up. I'm paranoid. That's rich coming from a man who's been photographing my financial documents and forging my signature to steal my life savings. That's not what happened. Oh, but it is exactly what happened, I continued. Did you really think I didn't notice you snooping through my office during your first visit? Did you think I was just some foolish grandmother who wouldn't recognize a con artist when I saw one? David tried aggressive denial, probably his last attempt to regain control. These are all misunderstandings, paperwork errors. You're making me sound like some kind of criminal over simple mistakes. Mr. Wilson cleared his throat and held up the forged documents. David, these aren't paperwork errors. These are felony forgeries with clear intent to defraud a senior citizen. The penalties are quite severe. David laughed, but it sounded forced and desperate. You can't prove criminal intent from some disputed signatures. Mr. Wilson smiled. Actually, we can prove intent quite easily. You see, Margaret was in Florida visiting family when you supposedly witnessed her signing these documents. We have plane tickets, hotel receipts, and restaurant bills proving she was 2,000 miles away. The reality finally seemed to sink in. David looked around the room like a trapped animal. This is all circumstantial. You can't prove I forged anything. Actually, Linda said, opening another folder, your signature patterns are remarkably consistent across multiple fraud attempts. I've been in touch with Rebecca Davis, Maria Santos, and Amanda Price. They're all very interested in pressing charges. David's last bit of composure snapped. Those women knew exactly what they were getting into. They were willing participants. The admission hung in the air like a confession written in lights. Jessica closed her eyes, processing that she'd been married to a man who saw vulnerable women as willing victims. Well, I said, straightening my sweater with satisfaction, I think we've heard enough, Mr. Wilson. Shall we proceed with filing those charges? Wait, David said desperately. Jessica, think about this. We have a good life together. I love you and Tommy. Don't let your mother destroy our family over some business disagreements. Jessica looked at him for a long moment, and I saw the exact instant when her last bit of love for him died completely. You destroyed our family the moment you decided to use us as pawns in your con game, David. I'm just brave enough to admit it's over. 3 days after our confrontation, Detective Harris called with news that made my careful planning feel even more justified. What we'd uncovered wasn't just one case of fraud. It was part of a pattern that had been damaging families across 4 states for nearly a decade. Mrs. Chen, I need you and your daughter to come in for a follow-up interview, Detective Harris said. We've been in contact with authorities in Oregon, Texas, and Arizona, and this case has elements that require coordinated prosecution efforts. Jessica and I arrived at the police station to find Detective Harris waiting with Detective Kim from the Financial Crimes Unit. The conference room table was covered with files and photographs that painted a picture of David's criminal career that was both extensive and disturbing. Mrs. Chen, Mrs. Martinez, Detective Kim began, we've been working with law enforcement in other states to build a comprehensive case. What you've provided has helped us connect several previously unrelated fraud investigations. How many other families has he targeted? Jessica asked quietly. 9 confirmed cases over the past 10 years, Detective Harris replied. Each case follows the same pattern. He targets single mothers or widows with money, builds long-term relationships, then attempts financial fraud once he's gained their trust. The scope was staggering. For 10 years, David had been refining his approach, learning from each victim what worked and what didn't. The good news, Detective Kim continued, is that your legal protections prevented any actual loss, Mrs. Chen. But your documentation has helped us understand his methods and build cases for his other victims. What about the other women? He asked. Will they get justice too? Mom, Jessica said as we listened to Maria Santos speak about her advocacy work. I've been thinking about what David said in court, that there are others like him. But I think he's wrong. We've all learned to see the signs now. The conference organizers asked me to speak about financial protection strategies. Standing at that podium looking out at survivors and their families, I felt the weight of our collective experience. 3 years ago, I thought I was just being a paranoid grandmother. I began. Today, I know I was acting on instincts developed over decades of watching people and recognizing patterns that didn't make sense. I talked about trusting those instincts even when family dismisses concerns. I shared practical strategies for protecting money and personal information. And I emphasized that no one should ever feel guilty for being cautious. David Martinez taught our families a valuable lesson, I concluded. He taught us that predators rely on our politeness, our desire to trust, and our reluctance to seem suspicious. But he also taught us that careful preparation and refusing to be victimized can turn the tables on even the most sophisticated con artist. As I drove home that evening, I thought about the promise I'd made to my late husband's memory 3 years earlier, to protect our family from the predator who'd married our daughter. Robert would have been proud that our granddaughter Jessica found the strength to fight back, and that our careful planning helped bring justice to families across multiple states. The house felt peaceful that night in a way it hadn't since David first walked into our lives. My financial protections were still in place, but they no longer felt like fortress walls. They felt like reasonable precautions taken by a woman who'd learned to value her own security and the safety of the people she loved. David was serving the second year of his 22-year sentence, and according to prison records, he was not adjusting well. The other inmates apparently had little patience for men who preyed on women and children. Sometimes justice comes slowly, but when it finally arrives, it's worth the wait. And sometimes the best revenge isn't just protecting yourself. It's making sure the predator never gets the chance to hurt anyone else again. I raised my evening tea in a quiet toast to the woman I'd become, to the choices that protected my family, and to the knowledge that some grandmothers are far more dangerous than they appear to innocent eyes. Thanks for listening to Anon Voices. Don't forget to subscribe and feel free to share your story in the comments. Your voice matters.